I'm delighted to welcome to This Irish American Life, Joseph M. Hassett. Joseph is someone we know at Luxman Ireland House for many years, and I suppose he's a man who wears a few hats, and the one I suppose that we are most excited, not to diminish your legal career at all, Joe, but the one we're most excited about it from an intellectual point of view, or at least in the context of our conversation today, is Joe's new book, Yeats Now, Echoing into Life. First of all, Joe, welcome to the program and thank you for taking time out today to be with us.
Thank you, Miriam. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and always a pleasure to be connected in any way with the Glucksman Ireland House, which is such a wonderful treasure.
We're always delighted to connect with you and always grateful for your support. And by way of introduction, I should say that Joe has written extensively on Yeats, on Joyce, and on other Irish writers. He holds a PhD in Anglo-Irish literature from University College Dublin and is a graduate of Canisius College and the Harvard Law School. His previous publications include W.B. Yeats and the Muses, that's published by Oxford University Press, 2010, and the Ulysses Trials, Beauty and Truth Meet the Law, and it's published by the same publisher, Lilliput Press, and that was 2016. This is a 2020 publication date, right, Joe? It's just out.
Just out. Hot off the presses.
Congratulations. And the first question, and I've already given myself the proviso for Joe because Joe is much more learned on W.B. Yeats than I. So what I've given myself a get out of jail pass in that regard, which is great because we can build out a little bit in the conversation on Yeats as a historical figure and as a poet, obviously. But how best, Joe, do you describe this book? Because it's an amalgamation of kind of, I don't know whether you say genres, or tell us about how you describe it.
Well, I'm delighted that, and I hope that anybody who listens or watches this will also be having the get out of jail pass on reading Yeats, because the idea behind the book, really two ideas that coalesced around the book, both are related to the idea that many people have a kind of an interest in reading Yeats, but they think he's possibly too complicated, or there's just too much to read about him before you could actually read a poem, or the poem might be too hard to understand. So it occurred to me that an interesting way into Yeats would be to just look at a line or two or three lines, which shed some wisdom on events in our own life or important occasions in our own life, and would be useful just in and of themselves as a kind of little catchphrases that would help us articulate our own feelings about a situation, a birth or an illness or a celebration of a friend or something like that, the occurrence of a pandemic. So that was one thought. And the related thought was that once you enter the poem through the line, which is often simpler than trying to bite off the whole poem, once you've entered the poem through the line, you kind of get comfortable in the poem or intrigued to know more about it. And I might not to go on too long, but I'll just take a random example. The poem Sailing to Byzantium, some people might think, oh, this is a complicated poem. And there's a lot of people have written at length about it. But it has an interesting couple of lines in it. Well, it has the line, "That is no country for old men," which became the title of a Cormac McCarthy novel and a movie. So that's a line. And in a way, that line in itself, it tells you something and arrests your attention. And then if you go on in the poem, there's the interesting line that kind of proceeds from that, which is, "An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress." Well, now that those are 4 lines. In the book, I think I've cut them to 3. They have the interesting idea that as one ages, and one doesn't have to be an aged man to experience the process of aging, which can occur to us quite early in life. To get the idea that Yeats is conveying there, that the process of aging can be overcome in some ways by letting your soul clap its hands and sing. Now, what does that mean? Any number of ways you could look at it, but many people have read it to be to do something creative. And so the great American painter Richard Diebenkorn knew those lines by heart, and he had a serious heart illness. And as he was facing complications of that, he would recite those lines to himself, and which he knew that whole stanza, and he knew probably the whole poem, and he could recite it to himself. And he painted a beautiful etching or series of etchings called A Coat. And so that was his way of having his soul clap hands and sing. So I take the line, soul clap its hands and sing, as an invitation to do something creative, which is a useful invitation to have during a COVID pandemic or at any time. Letting your soul clap its hands and sing is a kind of a nice shorthand way to think about doing something creative or self-restorative. And so maybe that's a long-winded way of saying it. That's an example of how a line from a Yeats poem, or 2 or 3 lines, can capture in a shorthand way an idea that has interesting application to our daily lives, period.
But Joe, I'm glad that in answering that you mentioned kind of visual arts, because I just hold up on on the camera here, you can see you use love beautiful imagery, and kudos to you and to Lilliput Press in terms of the production, publication, production part of it. That was important to you, the use of image, because often in books related to poetry there aren't that many images, right? And you pepper this very nicely with visual stuff.
Oh, well, thanks, ma'am. I'm glad to mention that. And yes, it was one of the great pleasures of putting the book together. And normally, it is an interesting thing, because I think there may have been a golden age in the past, somewhere long before my time, when publishers did all the work for authors, and they found all the images and they got all the permissions and everything. And in a way, that's all gone. And so it's the author's job, really, as you, I'm sure, know, to find some images, or the images. But I loved doing it, even though it was time consuming, because I wanted to make this a kind of a journey to the place that Henry James called the visitable past, in a very interesting passage he wrote it was in the preface to the New York edition, appropriately enough, of the Aspirin Papers. And he talked about, I won't quote him exactly, but he talked about the visitable past as being a time it's as though it were the place and time at the end of a long table. You're at one end, and at the end of the long table is the visitable past. And it's just far enough away, he says, that you get some perspective on it. And yet it's close enough that you can reach it. And in the Aspirin Papers, of course, it involves a writer's effort to find the letters of a poet in a palazzo in Venice. I spent a lot of time over a number of years tracking that down. I have a nice photo of that palazzo. The whole idea of the quest for the poet's papers is an interesting one. And so in this book, I love having some beautiful images, including, for example, the beautiful poem After Long Silence, which Yeats wrote to Olivia Shakespeare, who was his first lover. He sent that poem to her in a letter. And then as he's writing the letter, he says, and here's a poem. And It's a beautiful poem. I'm trying not to go on too long, but it goes to the interest in those artifacts, or the book as an artifact. That letter is in the National Library of Ireland, which kindly gave me permission to print it. And it is interesting, say, to go to a library, be it the National Library of Ireland, which is easier to get to in other times than right now, but any library that has a poet's papers or some writer's papers, kind of reading the papers with the poet's ink on them, and the letter, the stationery, the scrap of paper, the notebook, it does kind of bring you closer to it. And that poem, not to go on too long, but Yeats, he drifted away from Olivia Shakespeare because he wanted to pursue Maud Gonne, the long time object of his quest as a lover and a poet. And years later, he wrote to her saying, I came across a photograph of you going through my file the other day. He said, was there ever a like profile? He said, as if from a Sicilian coin, he wrote. And he said, I look back on my youth as, and I feel like an old man who's dying of thirst, who in his youth had cast away the cup half drunk. I wonder, do you ever feel that way? I mean, it's a fantastic letter. And then not too long afterward, he sends her the letter with that poem called After Long Silence, which I don't know if I can recite it, but it's that after long silence, it is right, all other lovers being estranged or dead. And he describes how it's the lamplight is turned down, the window shade is pulled. He says that we descant and yet again descant upon the supreme theme of art and song. Bodily decrepitude is wisdom. Young, we loved each other and were ignorant. Now that's a long answer to your nice question about the images in the book, but I think one pleasure of the book for me, both making it and having it myself, is a photograph of Olivia Shakespeare. It's the photograph, copy of the photograph Yeats was looking at when he wrote to her and said, I came across your photograph. And a photograph of that letter, which the National Library of Ireland kindly made available to me, in which Yeats writes that poem in the letter to Olivia Shakespeare. And I love that aspect of this book, which is designed really to make it easy to find one's way into Yeats's poems. And when you do that, you also find your way into his life. So thank you for noting that about the book.
No, it's beautiful. It's and I guess actually that's a nice segue to my next question, Joe, because you don't have to, listen to your great answer to that last question, or really or look at Roy Foster's wonderful, I guess, endorsement or whatever you call these on the back of books, to know that when you're picking up this book, you're looking at you're picking up a book on a topic that has been, what would you say, in gestation for a long time. And, your engagement with Yeats, you've put in print before. Maybe before we come back to the book a little bit more, can you tell me, and I don't know whether, because I'm not a literary scholar, Joe, but I feel like, for some of us who grew up in Ireland and learned, Yeats's poetry in school and stuff like that, like a lot of things, when you grow up in a place, you kind of take it for granted. And I think this book can have the effect of like showcasing or relearning or showing people, you know what I mean, kind of, and the way you've done it in terms of picking out the lines is a very accessible way for people to revisit this poetry. But how and when, I think it's a long period of time that you've been engaging with Yeats as a poet. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey?
I hate to tell you quite exactly how, how long the journey is.
You don't have to date yourself if you don't want to, Joe.
My mother, God rest her, would say you're younger with your hat on. But in 1963, which is the Annus Mirabilis in the famous Philip Larkin poem, you know, he says, well, oddly enough, this was a different experience because sex came late for me in 1963 between the lifting of the Chatterley Band and the Beatles' first LP. Well, Yates came first for me, a substitute in its way, a sublimation in 1963 as a result of an interesting couple of people really in my hometown of Buffalo, New York, who started something called a St. Patrick's Scholarship. And they raised money from patriotic Irish American people in Buffalo in small $5, $10, $20 contributions. And the scholarship sent a student, it sent 3 students from Buffalo in college, the junior year of college, to Ireland for a summer essentially. And there were 2 anchors to the summer. The first was the 2-week summer program at University College Dublin, which was a terrific program. And then I went to the 4th annual Yates Summer School out in Sligo. I think I spoke at the 60th a couple of years ago. So I've been at Yates for quite a while, but that summer really gave me the Yates bug in a serious way. I think there was something about being 20 years old, being in a beautiful place like Sligo that was so associated with some of Yates's poetry. And
how aware, Joe, were you? Were you like a literature major? Like how
I was
aware?
an English major, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, I had taken a course from a great teacher who was a big influence in my life named Charlie Brady, great, wonderful man. And I had taken a course from him called Yeats, Eliot, and Frost.
Oh, wow.
And so I had had a pretty good dose of Yeats before I went. But then I really got seriously into it there. There were great people teaching there. Tom Henn, the great T.R. Henn, wrote a great early Yeats study called The Lonely Tower. He was my good friend John Kelly's PhD mentor at St. Catherine's College, Cambridge, a giant of a man, really, in many respects. He was the head of the school. Frank O'Connor gave a talk there. Did his Yeats lecture, Yeats imitation. He kind of looked like Yeats, and he did a great imitation of Yeats speaking to the Abbey board. So that kind of really got me into a real fascination with Yeats. I went back, I went to law school. I owed the Army a couple of years. I was in the Army for 2 years. I went back to practicing law, and then I had the good fortune of meeting Gus Martin, a great influence on my life, and had the idea of, I had a sabbatical coming from my law firm, and I used it to go and be a student of Gus's MA in Anglo-Irish literature at University College Dublin.
Oh, wow.
And that kind of led to a PhD with Gus. And when I think today of how hard it is for graduate students to enter into the world of scholarship, I know how lucky I was both in finding Gus, and then Gus sent my MA dissertation to John Kelly, who was the then as he is now at St. John's College, Oxford, and the editor of the Yeats Letters, as the external examiner on the MA thesis. And then he sent it to the great Derry Jeffers, A. Norman Jeffers, on the PhD dissertation. And I got a letter from Derry Jeffers saying, your dissertation is going to be published by Gillen Macmillan and St. Martin's Press. So I said, well, good. Well, that's good to know. So in a way, the generosity of, and I found this to be true down to today, the generosity of the Yeats scholars is extraordinary, and they couldn't have been. One might think that because I'm a bit of an outsider and that I've never had a full-time teaching position, that I would be resented or excluded, but quite the opposite is true. That say Roy Foster volunteering that, maybe the technical term is blurb. Blurb for the back.
Know that. I should know that.
He just sent that in to Anthony Farrell at Lilliput and said, do anything you want with this. He volunteered it. Or say John Kelly, who, as I say, was the external examiner on my MA. He invited me to come over to St. John's and be a visiting scholar there for a term.
So Joe, when you were thinking about doing this book, you know, and forgive my ignorance because I'm just not a scholar in the field, there's nothing comparable to this style of a treatment of his works. And just so the readers know, the listeners or viewers know, for anyone who hasn't picked it up yet, you essentially thematically collect the poems under various headings, right?
Yes, thanks for getting me back to the book.
No problem.
It's great. Yeah. The idea is to go back to earlier on. I was saying that a line or two or three from Yeats can be quite a useful and helpful articulation of your own thoughts about some situation in life, like celebrating a friend or a marriage or any other life situation. So what I've done is I've identified those lines, and then I've grouped them around different subject headings. And so that for the reader of the book, if you were, say, for example, looking for something to say at a celebration of a friend, you could look under the heading friendship. And of course, the most famous one, which is in there, I mean, it's a great line, is think where man's glory most begins and ends, and say my glory was I had such friends. I mean, that's an interesting, oft quoted line. But to illustrate, I suppose, my point I was making before at great length is those two lines are pretty interesting, and they do say something that articulates a thought that a lot of us have in our minds, particularly on an occasion, say, like celebrating a friend. I think Keats says that a poem should be like almost a remembrance. And it is interesting. You take those two lines, it's almost as though you're remembering them, but because they articulate in a memorable way something that you might like to say on an occasion celebrating a friend. So the book organizes lines or pairs or threesomes of lines around topics like that. And as I say, it's an easy way also into the broader poem, which is, as you know, the municipal gallery revisited. And then it's also a way into Yeats's life, because his good friend Lady Gregory, for example, features heavily in that poem. He looks at her portrait, and I'm happy to say the municipal gallery, which is now called the Hugh Lane in Dublin, gave me a beautiful image of that Mancini portrait of Lady Gregory, which is in the book. And in the poem, the municipal gallery revisited, he looks at that portrait and he says, all that pride and that humility. And then it leads to that oft-quoted closing two lines. There's another great line I have in the book, which I think of now. A lot of these lines are, I find, not a lot, but there are a number of lines that are highly pertinent to the predicament we find ourselves in now with the COVID-19. And let me just find it. Here's the Mancini portrait of Lady Gregory, courtesy of the Municipal Gallery, Hugh Lane.
Isn't it? It's nicely rendered in the book as well.
Yeah, well, it's nice to have it right there, you know, next to that quote from that poem. Um, um, in 1909, Yeats learned that Lady Gregory was ill. She was a very close friend of his and a patron of his and an intellectual companion of his throughout his poetic career. And when he heard that she was ill, he wrote a little passage in his journal, and then he wrote a poem about it. And the passage in the journal ends with a wonderful line, which is, "Friendship is all the house I have." And the lead up to that line, he's saying how the thought of losing her, he said, I cannot, here it is, "She has been to me mother, friend, sister, and brother. I cannot realize the world without her. She brought to my wavering thoughts steadfast nobility. All day, the thought of losing her is like a conflagration in the rafters. Friendship is all the house I have." And then not long after that, he sent her what he called in the letter a little scrap of verse. And that scrap is a poem, and you'll find it in collected poems, called "A Friend's Illness." And I think about it today in particular. Sickness brought me this thought. In that scale of his, why should I be dismayed, though flame had burned the whole world, as it were a coal? Now I have seen it weighed against the soul. I mean, it's a fascinating idea, a powerful idea, that weighing the whole world being burned goes back to that conflagration in the rafters in his journal entry. Weighing that against the soul. I mean, it's pretty interesting. A friend. And so I think, in a way, I think of the terrible forest fires in California and around the world, the destruction of the Amazon, thinking anywhere in the world, the destruction of our planet. And then thinking of COVID-19, and then thinking of the terrible racial hatred and bias that infects so many societies, including our own here. We really feel the pressure of all that. And it's comforting and maybe salvific thought, in a way, to weigh it against a friend and say, well, anyway, we have friendships, and they can help sustain us through these tough times that we're all going through. So I think a lot of Yeats' lines do have interesting kind of resonance for our situation today.
Am I correct in thinking that on the campaign trail, or historically, Joe Biden is a Yeats quoter, right? I know he's
yes, yeah,
a little bit too, but I think he's a Yeats man too.
Oh, totally. And in fact, he started it, and he told me years ago, and I think he adverted to this in a little video they showed at the Democratic convention that nominated him. But he told me years ago that his he had a stutter as a young man. He still has a trace of it today. His uncle helped him to overcome his stutter by encouraging him to recite Yeats poems to himself in the mirror. And he did that, and he remembers it today. And he discussed that with that young boy who really was the highlight in my mind and in a lot of people's minds of the Democratic convention this year. And Joe, over the years, has quoted, he likes to quote from Easter 1916, "A Terrible Beauty is Born." He's quoted that a lot over the years. And then I think, did he recently quoted one that Bill Clinton used to quote all the time and may still, is from Seamus Heaney's beautiful translation of the Philactetes, the burial at Thebes. His translation is called it, "How once in a generation hope and history rhyme." Right. So, and it's interesting, Seamus Heaney, was the successor to Yeats as the winner of as an Irish poet who won the Nobel Prize. And he was conscious of that in many ways. And he, interestingly enough, in his Nobel speech, he discussed at length another Yeats poem, which I love and I feel is highly pertinent to our situation right now, to being locked in a pandemic and to being locked in by hatreds of all kinds, political and racial and any kind of hatred. It's the beautiful poem, A Stare's Nest by My Window, from Yeats's Meditations in Time of Civil War. And as I say, Seamus discussed that poem at length in his Nobel address. The poem is so interesting to me because it encapsulates our situation. Yeats wrote the poem when he was in his tower, Torbaillie, out in Galway during the Irish Civil War. And he felt enclosed, cut off from news, didn't know what was going on. Violence was around him outside. And in the poem, A Stare's Nest by My Window, he has the line, "We are closed in and the key is turned on our uncertainty." And it's that uncertainty really that I think we all feel keenly right now. And Yeats found his way out, and he wrote in some notes to the published version of his Nobel address that in that situation that I've just described during the Civil War, he said, men must have lived this way through centuries. And I felt overcome by a desire not to be overcome by bitterness and to lose all sense of the beauty of nature. And he said that as he was feeling that emotion, he noticed that he smelled honey where honey could not be. And then he noticed that a stare, which as he explains is our West of Ireland term for a starling, was building in an empty nest in his wall of his tower, Torbaillie. And so he wrote the poem. He said, out of the feelings of the moment, I wrote this poem, The Stare's Nest by My Window, which has the lines which apply so clearly right now. He says, we had built the heart on fantasies. The heart's grown, we had fed the heart on fantasies. The heart's grown brutal from the fair. More substance in our enmities than in our love. Oh, honeybees, come build in the empty house of the stair. I mean, that's a fantastic message coming from 1923 out of Torbaillie down right to today. We are closed in, key is turned, lock is turned on our uncertainty. Our hate, we've fed our hearts on fantasies and hatreds, and it's time to look for love, empathy, honey, sweetness. It's really, it's a beautiful poem.
Joe, so you, as we discussed, you divided, you kind of categorize the themes are on friendship, the moment alive, working, making your soul, loving, etc., etc. Was there one of those themes or topics that was more difficult or more of a challenge for you to get a hold of, or that you particularly enjoyed, or?
Well, let's see. I like the notion of making your soul. Actually, I kind of like that. And in a way, I think I like it because first my son, Matthew, and later my daughter, Meredith, both were interested in Henry David Thoreau. And in the idea, Thoreau says, I went to the woods that I might live deliberately, so that when it came time to die, I would not find that I had not lived. I'm not quoting him exactly, but certainly I went to the woods, the woods that I might live deliberately is Thoreau, and the rest is more or less Thoreau. So that's a very powerful thought. And Yeats, when Yeats wrote his famous poem, The Lake Isle of Innisfree, he was thinking about Thoreau going to the woods. And Yeats famously said he was standing on a street in London, and he saw some water bubbling in an ad for something, and it made him think of going of the Lake Isle of Innisfree, and he thought of Thoreau, and it led him to write that probably one of the most quoted poems in the world. So that idea of kind of going to Innisfree is one that I found interesting, and Yeats talks about that a lot with the notion of, he says in the poem, The Tower, now I shall make my soul. And he thinks, he's wrestling with the idea, and he writes in the poem Vacillation, he's wrestling with the idea of how do you live a rich, poetic, and contemplative life, and also get through the world and have a job and make a living. And he wrestled with that in various ways, and he wrote to Olivia Shakespeare, of all people, to say, I'm going to live like, I think I'm going to live like one of those Japanese in the Middle Ages who retired from the world at age 50 to pursue literature. And in the poem, The Tower, he says, now shall I make my soul. He's going to, he's got to an age where he's going to kind of withdraw a bit and focus on his inner life. I mean, it's really an idea that I found to be very compelling and congenial. And in that poem, the quote in the book, an interesting part about it, he says, now shall I make my soul, compelling it to study in a learned school, till the wreck of body, slow decay of blood, testy delirium, or dull decrepitude, or what worse evil come. And in the book, I interrupt there to say that Samuel Beckett loved that poem, and he loved those lines. And Beckett, walking home to his place in Paris from his friend Con Leventhal's, from the cremation of Con Leventhal's body, Beckett recited those lines, and he stopped and he leaned up against the wall and he braced his shoulders and he raised a glass of wine, and he went on to finish out those lines that said, or what worst evil come, from the poet's own testy delirium or dull decrepitude, or what worst evil come. And Beckett read, the death of friends, or death of every brilliant eye that made a catch in the breath, seen but the clouds of the sky. So there are some lines that caught the attention of somebody like Sam Beckett, who had a pretty fine eye and ear for words. But they were the words that went to that aspect of making my soul, which is something that Yeats thought a lot about, of how to do that, making your soul, whatever that might mean to you, and it can mean different things to different people, how to do that while still functioning in the world and making a living. There's two lines that I love in Yeats, which he says, the intellect of man is forced to choose perfection of the life or of the work. Very interesting. It kind of sets a dichotomy there, which when Yeats says, I'm going to make my soul, in the middle of his life, he's finding a way out of it because he's saying, well, I'll get to this point and then I'll make my soul. Now, in that poem I mentioned, Vacillation, which is a fabulous poem, he finds that he can do that in the middle of his, you don't have to retire from the world to do that. And he has a wonderful, I don't know if I could quote exactly in Desolation. He says he was sitting at a coffee shop in London when he said, for 20 minutes more or less, it seemed so great, my happiness, that I was blessed and could bless. So you can get those moments of transcendence at any time in an otherwise busy life, which Yeats's life was when he was in London. He was, unlike a lot of people think of a poet as being withdrawn from the world, he was very active. He was running the theater. He was publishing his poetry. He was dealing with his publishers. He was very involved in the politics of his country, and he was forever on the run, giving lectures, meeting people, lobbying Parliament over this and that, and very active. And yet he said he could sit there for 20 minutes more or less and feel he was blessed and could bless. And to loop back to Lady Gregory for a moment, it's one of the great lines, and I quoted in the book. He says, oh, beautiful poem, friends, now must I these three praise, three women who wrought what joy is in my days. And then he lists three, and one is Augusta Gregory, and he says, one who so changed me that I live laboring in ecstasy. It's very interesting that he learned from Gregory how to overcome that dichotomy of choosing perfection of the life or of the work, because he found he could labor in ecstasy. So the message there, in a way, is if you are lucky enough to find work that gives you joy, or if you're steadfast enough to find joy in whatever work has found you, it's a solution to the dilemma that you don't have to choose a perfection of the life or of the work. You can find joy, maybe not always ecstasy, but you can find joy in work. And he says, Gregory so changed me that I learned to live laboring in ecstasy. What is the end of Among School Children? He says, labor is blossoming or dancing, where body is not bruised to pleasure soul, nor beauty born out of midnight toil, I think, but where body is not, labor is blossoming, or labor can be blossoming or dancing. I'll leave it at that and not try to quote the whole thing and get it wrong.
It really is amazing, Joe, listening to you, how, what, 110 years later and stuff, the relevance to today and the universality that, and just the poetic phrasing, how it's it reaches through space and time so well.
Well, thanks, Miriam. I feel that that's true, and I feel that one reason why I focused in particular on Yeats and why I think it makes sense for this kind of book is that he did think deeply about these questions, and then he had that ability to create the magical line that's memorable and easy to quote, and it sounds nice to quote, and as I say, captures that thought.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful book, Joe. Congratulations again. Again, it's called Yeats Now, Echoing into Life by Joseph M. Hassett. Really nicely published by Lilliput Press. If you want to find out some more information about it, the Lilliput Press website and the Book Depository websites are good places to go. This has been really lovely, Joe. This has been a real personal and professional treat for me to have this chat with you.
Well, thank you.
And I'm just thinking of, you know, I'm thinking of you as a 20-year-old going to Ireland and going to your first Yeats summer school. And I bet you couldn't imagine that because, you know, it just, this book oozes the confidence and care, not confident way, confidence and care, and deep intellectual engagement over something over a long period of time. So it's beautiful to see that in something tangible, right?
Well, yeah, I thank you for saying that, Mary, because I do feel that way about it, and I feel that way about this book. I'm delighted with it, and actually now thinking about the first section on friendship, um, I think of Loretta Brennan Glucksman as a great friend to both of us and to everybody who's interested in Irish literature. So at this Glucksman House moment, I pause a moment to think about Loretta. What a fabulous legacy she's creating every day of her life for all of us. So
yeah, and when I was thinking about this, Joe, I was saying, Dan Mulhall is a great man on the poetry, and you're there in DC flying this flag as well. And it's when you step back from it, the impact of Irish poetry, and in particular of someone like Yeats, for a small island, it's phenomenal, right?
Oh, totally. And I do feel that that Yeats can claim some of the credit for that. Seamus, in Seamus's essay in the Field Day Anthology, he says that Yeats was the originator and primary exemplar of the nationality as a category of literature. Now that can be pushed too far, but it is an interesting thing that a small country like Ireland has more poets per square mile than a lot of much bigger countries. So
yeah, and how I just finished a book chapter, well, hopefully, assuming it's published, on Marcus Scarvey and the evolution of Garveyism in the post 1916 period. And he had spent time in London, and I don't necessarily know that he would have met Yeats, but he was on the periphery of these circles where people were sharing ideas. And it's amazing where, I guess, for me as a historian, it's always interesting to see where in particular Yeats crops up as a reference point, or as someone who people, others not connected to Ireland in any meaningful way, how his reach extended, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, it's interesting that I don't mean to go off too far on a tangent. One of the interesting things that I came across in my life as a Yeatsian was Yeats allowed Clement Shorter to publish 25 copies of Easter 1916, which he allowed it to be done in 1918, although he didn't allow the poem itself to be published until 1920. And of course, it's a poem about revolution. And I acquired one of those, and I gave it to UCD along with a letter that Yeats wrote to a journalist in Chicago named Isaac Levin, who was of Russian descent and who later wrote a history of the Russian Revolution. And he must have written to Yeats asking about this poem, Easter 1916. And I don't have what Yeats was responding to, but I did have Yeats's letter back to him, which said, how did you find out about this poem? It wasn't meant to be known except to a few friends. So I don't know the answer to that mystery, but there is an interesting thing that a Russian-born historian in Chicago, interested in the Russian Revolution of 1917, was very interested in Yeats's poem, Easter 1916. So
yeah, and we think of these, we think that the internet revolutionized everything, but these networks of communication and exchange were very robust. Listen, Joe, I'll let you go, and thank you for coming on This Irish American Life. It's always great to see you, even in this virtual space, and I'm really delighted to be able to get word out about this lovely book, both in content and aesthetically, to our audiences. And I really do hope I see you in non-virtual form soon.
Me too. Thanks, Miriam. It's been a pleasure, and I do look forward to it soon.
Thank you, Joe, and we'll see you soon.
Many thanks. Bye-bye now.